Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. Each month, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self-identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our program, please send us your questions and tell us where you are watching from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Frank Cohn share his personal firsthand account of the Holocaust with us. Frank, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person.
Well, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. I'm glad you joined.
And Frank, we have a short period, an hour, and you have so much to share with us. We'll get started. Frank, you were born in 1925 in Breslau, Germany. Before we turn to the Holocaust and the Second World War, please tell us about your family and your first few years.
Well, I was brought into a classic middle-class family in Germany, and it was a Jewish family. Here you see my mother and father and my canary bird. This was for my 6th birthday, I believe. It was a happy birthday sign that's showing right there. Anyway, I was the only child, and the way middle-class families worked, well, first of all, my parents had a sporting goods store, and that's what provided them with the income to live very comfortably. And as an only child, first of all, we had a live-in maid, which middle-class families had. And when I came along, they got another girl to help them take care of me. So it was a very comfortable life. And of course, I don't remember anything about the first 2 years or so.
Right. Frank, you described to me that your parents had what you called a sort of arranged marriage. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I guess it goes back to where they were brought up. It was after World War One. The areas that they were living in was near Posen, which became Poznan, and my parents didn't know each other, of course, at that point, and they decided that they had to go to Germany, and they went into Breslau. But my mother, when in that area where she was born, when it was still Germany, somehow fell in love with a young German officer, a lieutenant in the army, and the parents, of course, didn't look at this very gracefully and broke it up, and they could do that when they moved to Breslau, and that's when they arranged for the marriage between my father, who was 14 years older than my mother, and well, of course, they didn't have a love life right immediately, but they certainly got very much enamored with each other after a while and respected each other. And they had a very acceptable marriage.
Thank you, Frank. In the 1920s, the Nazis were a small, radical, fringe political movement that was attempting to seize power in Germany, and they regularly engaged in street violence. Your uncle Max was attacked by a group of Nazis in 1927. Tell us what happened.
Well, of course, I was too young at that point, but there was legal work that was going on. And I guess I was about 5 years old when I heard the adults talking with each other. They never explained these things to me, but the kids still listen, and they they form their own opinions. And I could hear that this man who was my uncle was attacked by a bunch of Nazis just because they found out he was Jewish, and they had him in the street, and they killed him for no specific reason at all, except that he was Jewish. This was a bit of a frightening situation for me because I knew I was Jewish, and I heard now that these Nazis were killing Jews. So the term Nazi became fearful to me at a very early age. And I recall also, I looked out of the window from my apartment that was situated right across from a finance office. And that finance office somehow drew a lot of people for demonstrations. And there were fights between the communists and the Nazis. And this, I asked about this, and that was explained to me that we really don't like either one of these groups. And Nazis, again, was a dangerous thing that came into mind, and it just stuck with me for all the years that I was there. Yeah.
Frank, before we continue, I'd like to let you know that we have people watching and listening to you today from around the country and indeed from around the world. We have viewers today watching in Massachusetts, Ohio, Texas, and Virginia, and we have international viewers in Canada, Cyprus, France, and Argentina.
Well, that's wonderful. And just hello, everybody.
Frank, after your Uncle Max was killed in 1927, Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, 6 years later, when you were just 7 years old. Can you share with us some of your first memories of this period?
Well, the first thing that happened was right after he came to power, the Nazis started demonstrations in front of stores owned by Jews, as they did our store, our sports goods store. And my father saw the sign that says, "Don't buy from Jews." And he recognized that this was going to be a losing proposition. And he decided right then and there to get rid of the store. And he sold it at the best price that he could get. And then he had to see what else he could do. And he turned to selling bales of cloth to either manufacturers or tailors or individuals who needed some cloth. And we had to, because of this change, we had to move into a cheaper apartment, and that apartment immediately got one room where all these bales of cloth were stacked up to be sold.
Frank, please tell us about your experience in the second grade and about your teacher, Herr Schubert.
Well, first of all, my first grade teacher was not memorable. To me, he was very old. He was at least 50 years old or so. Anyway, second grade came in, and there came Herr Schubert, and he was a young fella, somewhere in the late 20s or early 30s, I would suspect. Of course, I never asked him how old he was. But thinking back, I was really enthused with him, and I thought he really liked me. And then I heard he was coming back in the third grade to teach us as well. And I was all excited, and I was waiting for him to come, and he came in full Nazi uniform, as you can see him in the middle of that picture. And pretty soon, yep, that's me. And pretty soon, all the other kids in the class started to be in the Hitler Youth, and they got all these uniforms, paraphernalia that they wore to class, like a hat or a belt or a shirt or whatever. And here was the class that made me an outcast, because when they started to sing the Hitler songs, I was told, "You're Jewish. While everybody else has to stand up, you can't. You got to stay seated." Of course, a kid who sits while everybody else stands is not going to be a very popular kid. So I was not popular. I was an outcast.
Frank, how did Herr Schubert actually treat you in the midst of all those changes?
Well, actually, he treated me very fairly, aside from the fact that he separated me from others when they sang their Hitler songs. If anybody started to pick on me, he didn't want that. I think he wanted order in his classroom. But that was not the problem for me. After the class, there were kids who found out that I was Jewish, and they chased me yelling, Jew boy, but I was a very fast runner, and I was able to evade them. And when I told my parents about that, they said, well, we'll have to change that. And they then disenrolled me from the German public school and enrolled me into a Jewish private school. And I was certainly much more comfortable in that Jewish private school. Well, just a few months later, in 1935, laws were passed when Jews no longer were allowed to be in public school. And at that point, the parents would have had to get me transferred into the Jewish school anyway. But I was one step ahead. And here I am in the first row. I think they can kind of put a circle on me.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Frank,
me. And this was a boys and girls class, different from the public school. But I was very comfortable, and I had lots of friends among the boys. The girls was scary because I was an only child. I wouldn't know how to deal with a girl.
Frank, tell us about your gym teacher in your private Jewish school.
I loved my gym teacher, and I wasn't particularly good in gym, and he knew that, of course. But somehow he singled me out, and sometimes I saw him in a synagogue, and he would motion to me to come and sit next to him, and I was always thrilled to do that. And somewhere along the line, he told us about his trip to the United States, and he told us about the skyscrapers. He told us about the Statue of Liberty and what that meant. And then he told us about the Horn and Hearted restaurants. Now, those were restaurants where you had to have a lot of coins, and you put your coins in and you open a little door, and lo and behold, there was either a soup or an entree or dessert, whatever you want. And you could see that, of course, in advance by looking through those windows. And I was really all excited about something like that. And I thought to myself, one of these days, maybe I'll get to the States and I'll go to a Horn and Hearted restaurant after I look at all the skyscrapers and the Statue of Liberty. But I was all focused on that, even though there were no plans at all for me to go to the United States.
Frank, throughout the 1930s, the Nazi regime implemented more restrictions on Jews throughout Germany. How did that impact life for you and your parents?
Well, it was a very subtle and they called it like slicing salami, always another slice and another restriction. And somehow, of course, it made our community pull together as a Jewish community because we would have no more relationships with the Germans in Germany. And in 1935, the law specifically segregated us from the Germans. And we had to let go of our maid, Berta, who was almost like a second mother to me, but she was no longer allowed to work for Jews. Germans were not allowed to work for Jews. And then the restaurants started to get signs, Jews not desired or Jews forbidden. And pretty soon there were no just restaurants that we could go to. And I was in a soccer team, but it was all Jewish players, of course. And we could only play Jewish teams. We could never play anybody else. And so it was. We got ourselves completely separated. And but the one thing that became a focus to me was the parents admonishing me to always behave, 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 because they didn't want ever to have ourselves be called to the attention by the community, and I understood that I really had to toe the line.
Frank, even though this was an extraordinarily difficult time, you were able to celebrate your bar mitzvah when you turned 13 years old. Tell us about it.
Yeah, there I am, probably just a little bit before my bar mitzvah. And I had to study for the bar mitzvah and perform in the synagogue by presenting certain prayers and so forth. And I must have done pretty well because I was congratulated. And then there were lots and lots of presents for me, one of which was a BMW bicycle. That was my first bike, and I was all enthralled about my bike. And then good knows how many pen and pencil sets I received. And of course, the congratulations from all my friends and such. So it was a terrific feast that I was experiencing there, being the center of it. And then a little bit later, my father pulled me aside and said, I have some serious talk to make with you. And he told us, he told me that he had really lost the ability to earn a living in Germany, and he had to do something else. He had some distant relatives in the States, and he was going to go to the States to see if he could find them and get an affidavit. Now, an affidavit is a document that guarantees that the people that receive the affidavit will never become a burden to the government. So the person who is executing the affidavit must have enough money to support those people who he has guaranteed will not become a burden. Anyway, my father made the preparations to leave because all he was allowed as a visitor to take out of Germany, by German law that is, was 10 marks and one suitcase. So all arrangements had to make in advance. He could book his hotels in advance and his voyage in advance and such, and pay for that in Germany before he left. But when he left, he only had 10 marks. So he was at the mercy of the Jewish Relief Organization.
Frank, just for translation, tell us how much money 10 marks really was.
Well, I think the dollar was about 2 marks 50 in those days. And 10 marks, obviously not going to go very far in that kind of exchange rate.
Like nothing, absolutely nothing.
He had no money really when he left.
So when he got to the United States, what did he find? What happened?
Well, he did discover and found all his distant relatives, and they were very nice to him. They entertained him and invited him and such, but none of them was in a position because of the depression in those days. They did not have the money to support an affidavit, and he had to stay a little bit longer to see if he could find someone else to give him an affidavit. And believe it or not, it was a very lucky thing that happened to him.
And I know you'll tell us a little bit more about that a little bit later. And of course, Frank, while your father had gone to the United States to seek the affidavit, you and your mother remained behind in Germany. Tell us about the very frightening encounter that you and your mother had at your apartment in Breslau, and also tell us about your parents' friend, Mr. Michaelius.
Well, it was because he had to stay longer that he was not home when 2 Gestapo agents came to our door looking for him. And my mother told them that he was on a business trip overseas, and she was instructed to advise him the minute he got back to report to Gestapo headquarters. Well, that sort of raised a red light in both my mother's and in my mind immediately, because we associated it with a story that we had and that had been told about a business acquaintance of my father by the name of Michaelis. And Mr. Michaelis was one who also received the request to report to Gestapo headquarters. And he did that. And a few hours later, He was found on the pavement in front of the headquarters. He had either jumped or been pushed out of a third floor window. And that came to our mind immediately. And my mother, when the Gestapo left, wrote a letter to my father to whatever he does, he better stay in the States, because if he were to come back right now, he would be arrested by the Gestapo.
And Frank, during this time that you're describing, a British informant for the Gestapo was placed in your home with you and your mother. How did that come about, and what effect did that have on your life?
There was this lady that came to our door with an official document that said that we were obligated to provide her with a bedroom. And of course, with an official document like that, there was no refusal. And we made a room available for her. And she introduced herself as a British lady. And she was trying to be very nice, as a matter of fact, and offered herself to provide me with English lessons. And I accepted, and I had 2 English lessons, which proved very valuable later on, although we never discussed that, of course. And my mother had pulled me aside and said, "Now we have to be very careful what we say in this apartment, because this lady is is reporting to the Gestapo." So whenever we wanted a conversation, she told me we have to go outside for a little walk. And that's a conversation we had. Very soon thereafter, she said, "Let's go outside." And she said to me and asked me, "Should we go?" And I knew immediately what she meant. And this was a rough question for me, because all my friends were there. I was here's one of them, Peter Friedlander. He and I were together on our soccer team, and I had a nice position up on the front line, which I liked. And I had a stamp collection. I had that BMW bike, which I loved. So there were lots of things that would have kept me in Germany, but I didn't really hesitate. I understood that I was an outsider in this country, and that the people in the country really didn't want me. And I said to my mother, "Let's go." And she said, "Okay, but you got to keep your mouth shut and don't talk about this to anybody." And I listened to her. I had one more soccer play to a team. The team had one more game to play, and I came to it, and I was very distracted, and I helped them lose the game. And at the end, I said, "See you next time." But I knew there was not going to be a next time, and I never really heard or saw anything about all of my friends as to whatever happened to them when I left the next day.
Frank, we have a question from one of our viewers named Candace, and she has written in to ask, "Dear sir, how did you get out of Germany?"
How did I what?
Get out of Germany.
How did I get out of Germany?
Yeah.
Well, as I said, the next day we were leaving, and it was 5 o'clock in the morning. We had our one suitcase, just like my father, the 10 marks, the one suitcase, and my mother had made all kinds of arrangements in advance with well, we had first class passage on the Holland America Line steamer Stadendam, and we had 2 weeks of hotel reservations. And our visas, she had gotten the visa, and then the next day, completely out of character, she had gone back and bribed an official in the American consulate to place my name on that visa. And it was easy because I was on her passport. So at 5 in the morning, we tiptoed out so we wouldn't wake Mrs. Griffith. And we got on the train to Berlin. And in Berlin, she said goodbye to her father, who later died in a concentration camp. Mm-hmm. She said goodbye to her oldest sister, but her sister and her family got out of Germany later to Australia, but she never saw her again either because Australia was much too far.
Frank, were you able to say goodbye to any other family members or friends?
Well, when we got to Holland, we got across the border and we were happy we were out of Germany. But in Holland, there was a family there. One of her first cousins, by the name of Kurt Josephson, had escaped from Germany to Holland. Of course, we did not know that, but this was not a good escape route because the Germans, when they moved into Holland, put him in a concentration camp. But somehow he and his wife both survived, but their son, who was my age, was on a field with 100 other kids, and they didn't feed them and they didn't clothe them, and it was freezing cold, and those kids, one after another, just died on that field, either frozen to death or starving from hunger. None of them survived.
Frank, you and your mother made it to the United States on October 30th, 1938. Tell us about the journey and about your arrival in New York City.
Well, the first class passage was a terrific journey. There's my mother on the Statendam, and I was really living it up. I had all the enjoyments and the food and whatnot, and I almost became a ping pong champion, but one man beat me, so I didn't quite make it. And I had no worries whatsoever and looked forward to getting into New York Harbor. But my mother was very much concerned because she was worried about going to Ellis Island, because she had heard that people who were coming into the United States first had to go to Ellis Island, where they were interrogated, perhaps, and the information could flow out, because she was not a good liar, that my father was already in country, and had they known that, they would have recognized we were not visitors, we were refugees, and would have put us on the next boat going back to the States. Here's a picture I took of the skyline of New York with my box camera in anticipation of what I was going to see, as my gym teacher had told me. I did that also with the Statue of Liberty, and I was now all geared up to go to Horn and Hardart. And that was one of the first things I asked my father when I got off the boat and greeted him, and we had our happy reunion. I said, Father, take me to Horn and Hardart. And he sort of chuckled. He said, we'll take care of that. We'll do that.
So you went to those little automated vending machines and got your meal.
Coins, and I got my soup, and I got my entree, and I got my dessert.
Frank, just a few days after your arrival at the end of October in the United States, in fact, November 9th through 10th, the Nazis perpetrated a vicious assault on Jews, synagogues, and Jewish-owned businesses known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, which took place throughout Germany and Austria. What effect did that have on your family?
Of course, this pogrom against the Jews hit all the newspapers all over the world, as it did in New York. And my parents were looking for any news that they could, because the people in the States did not have our address. We made sure that there wasn't going to be any compromise here. And so we had no way of getting any direct information. So we were very, very concerned about all of our relatives as to what would happen to them. And what we heard about all these arrests, and we knew some of our relatives would have gone into concentration camps. But the irony of the whole thing was that this catastrophe for the Jews became a savior to us, because when President Roosevelt heard about this, and he issued an executive order that stated that nobody would be forced to return to Germany. So our visitors' visa were extended indefinitely, and we were saved.
A viewer is asking, a viewer by the name of Marisol is asking, did you have relatives still in Germany the night of Kristallnacht?
Oh, absolutely. We had a lot of extended family relatives. And as it turned out, there were 11 relatives who died in concentration camps. And then the rest of the relatives were dispersed throughout the world. There were 6 countries that they ended up in, like Brazil and Haiti and Australia and some European countries and England, and of course, the United States and Israel. So the family never got together again. They were just dispersed throughout all these countries.
Frank, now that you and your mom and your dad are in New York City, your mother enrolled you in the 7th grade. What do you remember about attending school in the United States?
Well, of course, it was difficult. And as I was an outcast in Germany in the German schools, I suddenly found myself an outcast again because I couldn't speak English well enough. And I recall on the first or second day in junior high school, the teacher turned to me and said, "Take the waste paper basket and collect the trash." And I couldn't understand a word she was talking. And she had looked at the window. I thought she wanted me to open the window. I opened the window. Of course, the whole class laughed, and no kid likes to be laughed at. So I had a great incentive to learn English. And I did that. Well, first of all, the teachers were very helpful. They got magazines and wrote up the various names of things that were shown in the pictures. And I listened to the radio. Now, the radio was difficult for me because I couldn't understand what was really the program all about. But I could get the intonations, so I could avoid that German accent. I heard the intonations, and I tried to copy what I heard. But what really taught me was the movies, and it was 10 cents for a movie, and 10 cents was a lot of money for us. But I earned that money, believe it or not. What happened was there was a Time magazine program that was shown, a newsreel program, just before every movie. They had this, and I was invited to have an arrangement as if we were in Germany, and they had a blackboard. I had to stand next to the blackboard with my head bowed down, and the blackboard showed something about that the Jews were the big enemies of Germany. And for that, I received $100. Now, just standing there for about a couple of minutes wasn't worth $100. So I think they were trying to help a refugee kid. But that money helped me learn English because it paid for all those movies.
All those movies.
Yeah.
And Frank, while you were learning English through the movies, how did your parents adjust to their new life in the U.S., and how did they earn a living?
Well, it was pretty difficult in the beginning. We were in a one-room sublet apartment of a Greek widow who had led the apartment, and we took this one room and kitchen privileges and paid for it from the money that we received from the Jewish relief organizations. And those people were very nice. There was a brother who took my father to the bar. My father never had frequented bars, but he went because he thought he should. He was invited. And then the man left money after paying the bill. He left the change on the table. And when my father collected it and tried to give it to him, you left your tip, the rest of your money from the tip on the table. He said, no, that's not my money. He was just trying to be gracious to give him some money and not embarrass him. But later on, my parents got work permits. So my father got a job in the Eagle Pencil Company, and my mother became a millinery worker, making hats for people. But when the war started, nobody wanted a hat anymore, and she ended up being a caterer for Temple Emmanuel in New York.
Frank, the United States, of course, entered the war following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. You graduated from high school in June 1943. Right after your 18th birthday, you were drafted into the U.S. Army. Please tell us about being sworn in as a U.S. citizen during your basic training and what that meant to you.
Well, when I was drafted, I first had to go to a reception center. That was Fort Dix, New Jersey. And you usually stay there for 3 days where you get processed, and then you go to basic training and some other location. Well, everybody was processed as I was, and then they left and I didn't. So I went over to my sergeant and said, what's with me? I don't have orders. And he said, let me check. He came back. He said, well, it's very simple. You're an enemy alien. I was shocked. Enemy alien? I never heard that term before. I knew I was stateless because the passport that I was in, which my mother had, was stamped by the German consulate in New York as no longer valid. We became stateless that way. But enemy alien, well, he explained, you were born in Germany, you were brought up in Germany, you had a German passport, that was the last passport you had, and Germany's at war, and you're the enemy, and you have to be investigated by the FBI. So I stayed there for 3 months, and obviously I must have passed the investigation because I got orders to Fort Benning, Georgia, for my basic training. And one fine day, they took me to Columbus, Georgia, the Middle District Court of Georgia, and I was sworn in as a U.S. citizen. And boy, I was proud. I was congratulating myself. I patted myself on the shoulder because nobody else did. And I was very, very happy because I was no longer an enemy alien. I was just like everybody else, and I felt great.
Frank, you left the United States for England as an infantry replacement soldier in September 1944, and you were soon sent to France and Belgium. Shortly after that, you were assigned to an intelligence unit. Tell us about your training for the intelligence unit.
Well, I was a infantry replacement going into England and then across to the invasion beaches to Utah Beach. But by then they had built a little dock, and I never got my feet wet when I got off the assault boat that we got on. And then we went through France and then into Belgium, all the way up to the front lines in Malmedy, where we went to the foxholes. But I must have been earmarked because I never got an assignment to any unit. And they had found out I spoke German. So they brought me all the way back to Le Vesonnet near Paris for a 2-week course in intelligence. And after that, I became an intelligence agent. So the course was designed after a 8-week course that was given at Camp Ritchie. And some of you might have heard about the Ritchie boys. Well, I was not a Ritchie boy. I was a sort of a supplement of a Ritchie boy because mine was but a 2-week course. And I ended up the same way like everybody else. I ended up with a team, a 6-man team, 2 officers, 2 interpreters, and the 4 of us wore the same uniform. No insignia on rank, only the US, as you see on my cap.
Right.
That was our rank designation. And then we had a driver and a non-commissioned officer in charge. Now, actually, the driver outranked me, but he didn't know that, and I was ordering him around all the time because I needed a vehicle, and I didn't know how to drive. So
Frank,
that team then went all the way through, all the way to Belgium, and we got into Belgium around the 3rd or so of December 1944.
And then, of course, shortly after that, on December 16th, 1944, the German military launched what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, which was a last-ditch German military counteroffensive against the Allied armies in the West. You found yourself in that battle. We have footage of U.S. soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge. Describe for us what we're seeing here, Frank.
Well, we were on a defensive, and these weapons were being used to stop the Germans as they came up. But the picture that you're seeing is very typical, because when anybody was going to ask you about the Bulge, the first thing that comes to mind was the cold. It was just miserable. Not only cold, but it was either raining or sleeting or freezing rain or snow. And we were in, our mission became looking for Germans who had penetrated in American uniforms, and we had to patrol in jeeps with the windshield down and no top, of course, because we should have been able to shoot, and you can't do it with either the top up or the windshield up. So even going 25 miles an hour was a big blast. But I was a PFC, and I was lucky that way. I was able to get behind the captain, and he got the blunt of the blast that came in the driving, and I hid behind him. But he never knew that he was helping me to survive in a better way than he was surviving. But we were all cold, and we never got warm.
Frank, if you don't mind, describe for us your first night in the Battle of the Bulge.
Now, that was probably the most frightening night of the entire combat situation that I went through. And it wasn't because I was in personal danger per se, but because of the rumors that were going out and the orders that we received. For example, I was told to get onto one of these dirt access roads and to make sure that no German would come through. That was my order. I had a rifle and I had a flashlight, and the order, don't let any Germans through. So I got in the middle of the road, and the first truck that came, I stopped him, and the guy yells out, "What the hell are you doing there?" I said, "I'm making sure you're not a German." He said, "If you were a German, you'd be dead by now. If you want to do anything, you better get in the ditch right next to the road." So I thought, well, he had a point. I got into the ditch. The next vehicle that came, I yelled, "Halt, halt, halt." They never heard me. They just went right by me. So I wasn't doing my job. And then there were shooting going on all over the place. And there were rumors about parachuters coming down. And you just didn't know what was going on. You didn't know what you were supposed to do. And then at midnight, they called me back, and we went into a blackout move towards Antwerp. We didn't know it, but Antwerp was really the goal of the German offensive of the Bulge. But we never got to Antwerp. We got to Namur, and that is where we got our orders to look for those Germans.
Frank, I have to share with you before I ask you any more questions. A viewer named Janine wrote, "I was a 2-year-old Belgian girl at that time. Thank you for coming to Belgium to rescue us."
Oh, that's very nice. And I can remember all the towns: Namur, Dinant, Rochefort, Remouchamp, Ciney, Liège. I know all those towns, and I know exactly where you came from.
Frank, we do also have a video question from a student named Amber from Maryland. Let's hear from Amber.
What was the most interesting story for your time in the military as you were liberating different territories after World War II?
Hello, Amber. You know me and I know you. Anyway, that's a rough question, because I have all kinds of stories that I can tell about every city that I went through, because we had orders to go into the big cities right after the infantry, where we had dossiers for building targets and personality targets. We had to screen those to see if anything had to be exploited to help the occupying force after the war was over, if anything was useful, and we had to identify anything that could be used for the prosecution of war criminals. So let me tell you about the one thing that I was perhaps most proud of having identified. We had a bunch of prisoners when we got to Frankfurt in a bombed out hotel next to the railroad station. And we found some places where we could have some interviews. And there was this brigadier, he was a major general who stood at attention in front of me, a young kid, a young Jewish kid who he didn't know, and I wasn't going to tell him, had to be a refugee and escape from Germany, from the Nazis when he was a kid. And here now this general had to stand in attention in front of me. So the roles were completely reversed. And I was real happy about that, per se. And I asked him his name. He says, my name is August Wilhelm von Hohenzollern. Well, immediately I alerted because I recognized what this was. And looking at him, I recognized who he was. And I stopped the interrogation right then and there and ran over to the captain. And I said, I have a big one. So the captain said, who do you got? I said, I got Prince Auwe. Prince Auwe is the son of the Kaiser. And had the monarchy existed after World War I, he would have been the next one in charge of Germany. And of course, they took him right away. And for a deeper interrogation. And that was the last thing I saw, heard of Prince Auwe.
Well, that was a big one indeed, Frank. There's no question about that. I'd like to share another audience question with you, if I can, Frank, and that is, a viewer wrote in to ask, did you experience any anti-Semitism in the U.S. service, in your U.S. service?
Well, overall, I really didn't. I can only recall one incident, and that happened right after the war, where a member of the T-Force, that intelligence unit that we were attached to, invited me to go to the MCO club. We did. And when we were sitting there drinking our beer, he says to me, I really hate Jews, but you're different. I like you. And as a matter of fact, after the war, I'm going to invite you to come and visit me in Queens with my parents. Well, I was completely aghast and I had no answer for him. That was completely unexpected. But the one thing I knew right away was, hey, I wasn't going to visit you in Queens with those parents who obviously were anti-Semites and who might not even like me. Anyway, I never had any direct anti-Semitism that I experienced. And I was in the Army for 35 years, so it was a long time. Now, was there any anti-Semitism that might have affected me indirectly? I don't know. They certainly wouldn't tell me, but I might not have received some assignment or some schooling because I was Jewish. But if that happened, I didn't know about it.
Frank, you continue to serve in Europe after the war ended in 1945. In the little time we have left, tell us about the work you were assigned to do supporting the prosecution of war criminals.
Well, this was me right there at the Document Center, the Intelligence Center in Oberursel, Germany, near Frankfurt. And I received the mission to, with a Jeep, go across Frankfurt every morning and meet a squad of prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, who helped me to create documents that we were sending back to the States that were sent back in support of the prosecution of these Germans who were going to be tried for war crimes. And those POWs helped me crate it, and I put the label on top of the crate that these were secret or top secret documents, and out they went, and that was the end of my responsibility for them.
Tons and tons of papers like we see here, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Those could have been the documents that I received, and we put in crates.
Yeah.
And I got promoted in the meantime, and then I became Sergeant of the Guard. And as a Sergeant of the Guard, it was for the outer perimeter, and we really didn't know who was on the inside of that camp. We always thought it was Goering, and it wasn't Goering. Goering was imprisoned in Berlin with the other people who were tried by the Nuremberg tribunal. The people we had, I found out later, were people who were tried by the second Nuremberg trial. And these were concentration camp commanders and deputies of the primary Nazis. They also were tried in Nuremberg, and some of them were executed also after the trial. So these were real important people, but we didn't know who it was. It was very good security. The only people we allowed to enter were the guards and the interrogators and the lawyers who were allowed access.
Frank, tell us, if you don't mind, about your return from serving in Europe during the war and reuniting with your parents.
Well, you had to have enough points before you were shipped back, and the points were how long you were in the overseas theater. And it took me, it took me a year to get enough points for me to be able to go back. And when I reported that to my boss at SHAEF headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Gronick, he said, "Oh, I'm going to help you go back in style." And he gave me 2 crates of secret documents, things like I shipped back to the States. And he said, "I want you to deliver those 2 crates in the port of Brooklyn in New York, and I'm going to put you on a Navy ship." And that voyage on the Navy ship was terrific. It was a little slow, but I was in first class accommodations, particularly as far as the food was concerned. I never ate that well that entire time that I was in Europe, and the Navy knew how to feed people. Anyway, I got to New York, and then I was stuck in Brooklyn because I came in just before noon, and the taxi drivers, they earned their money on these short trips. And at noon, they had a lot of short trips, and they didn't want to take me all the way to Manhattan. After the lunch hour, one cab driver took pity on me and took me all the way back to Manhattan. And I had my duffel bag, and I got into the vestibule in front of my apartment. I dumped the bag, and I couldn't get myself to ring the bell. I left the building. I walked through the neighborhood, and I calmed down a little bit. I saw all these places which I knew well from before I went to the Army. And finally, I was in position to go back. I rang the bell, and of course, I was greeted very, very heartily by my mother. She was so happy to see me. And then my father came from work, and he was very happy to see me. And it was a wonderful reunion, but it was a short-lived one because just 10 days later, he died of a heart attack that was sustained when he was at work. And he went to the hospital and never recovered. But at least I had this week or so with him before he died.
That must have just been so devastating for you, Frank. Frank, you shared with us earlier, about some of family members who were able to get out to, I think you said 5 or 6 different countries. How many family members did not make it out?
Oh, goodness. We had so many distant family members. I really don't have a number, but it must have been well over 30. and they were distributed all over. Now, about 8 of them were in the States, so we met those again, and we had meetings with them. But we certainly lost personal contact with all the others because they were just too far away. I did make a trip to Israel, and I saw my cousin over there in Israel. And I had planned to go to Australia, but from Vietnam, there was a possibility to go to Australia. But I only had one chance of a rest and recreation, and I went to Hawaii, where I met my wife and my daughter Laura. That was more important than Australia. But a couple of cousins from Australia actually came to visit us. So there was some sporadic personal contact, but the family certainly never got together again.
Frank, before I ask you the last question I have for you today, I want to share one last comment from our audience with you today. Lynn writes, "You are one of the most eloquent and joyful speakers I have ever listened to. I could listen to you for hours. Your wonderful spirit and amazing memory shine through. Thank you."
Oh, goodness. Thank you so much. I don't want to talk for hours. I think you probably heard enough of me right now. But anyway, that's very nice.
Frank, my last question for you is this. As we face rising anti-Semitism and related conspiracy theories, please tell us what we can learn from what you experienced before and during the Holocaust.
That's a rough question, too, because this is what's going on right now. There's so much hate around, and it's the hate that we have to be careful of, and that has to be stopped one way or the other. It has to be confronted, and it has to be confronted early, because if you let the hate fester long enough, then it gets so ingrained that you can't get rid of it. And things like what happened in Germany, where the hate is not just the anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism is like the canary bird in the mine. It's a warning signal, because pretty soon the hate spreads to others, and others are pulled into this hate, and you don't know if you are one of those who are hated, or if you might become a hater. Anyway, the Holocaust is a lesson, and that is a lesson that I try to bring about and confront in these speeches that I have. And the Holocaust Museum is the perfect place that sponsors me and so many others, that can tell about what can happen if you let the hate fester. And I do hope that I am able to continue this and talk to young groups particularly, and tell them, learn from history, learn the history lessons so that you don't repeat them. And that is what's so important. And that's why I'm here today also.
Frank, thank you so much for being our first person today. Just like Lynn said, I think we actually could all listen to you for hours and hours, and I wish that we could. I'd also like to share with the audience that, as you mentioned, Frank, you had 35 years in the U.S. Army, and you ended up being responsible for all military police throughout the greater Washington, D.C. area. So thank you, Frank.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I'm so glad that all of you out there joined us. And I hope you can bring something out of this. Bye-bye.
I'd like to also take a moment to thank our donors. First Person is made possible through generous support of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to invite you to join our next program. Please tune in on November 16th, 2022 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Holocaust survivor and museum volunteer Aryeh Efrath. Aryeh and his parents fled to a small village in western Slovakia, where brave strangers risked their lives to hide the family. Please join us next month to learn about Aryeh's story of survival. Thank you for watching.